Well, good evening and welcome to this week's Wednesday night worship. We're carrying our way through the book of Ecclesiastes, and this week we have reached Ecclesiastes chapter 3. So let me read that to us, and then we'll have a think about it together. So Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them, so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is vapor. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upwards, and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The book of Ecclesiastes is probably not the most well-known books in the Bible, but I guess chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, or at least the first 8 verses of it, are probably more well-known than others. It's quite a popular poem, used in funerals often, even atheist funerals I've heard it used. And indeed, many people have been using it in reference to the current time, the current season that we're going through with coronavirus, particularly perhaps emphasising that a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And so this poem, speaking of a time for this and a time for that, a season for this and a season for that, well appreciated and seen by many as a beautiful poem. Or not. Because while many people quote the first 8 verses, we see that Ecclesiastes doesn't stop at chapter 3 verse 8, but carries on to chapter 3 verse 9. And in verse 9 there, it turns what could be seen as a very beautiful poem into something perhaps slightly less beautiful, because in verse 9 there's a real sucker punch. As he ends this poem speaking of a time for this and a time for that, a season for this, a season for that, verse 9 he says, but what do workers gain from their toil? In other words, he says, yes, there's times for such things and there's seasons for such things, but as workers we can't get any gain from it. We can't control those times and those seasons to extract gain and profit from it. It's vapor. He's saying we have very little control over the times and the seasons of life. He's reminding us that we have very little control, for example, over the day of our death. I remember being at a funeral not so long ago, and in one of the tributes, the person spoke of the person who had died and said he had a very full diary planned for this day. Little did he know it would be the day of his funeral. And that reality of being able to perhaps see the different seasons of life, observe the different times of life, but not being able to control them, is portrayed very powerfully in two pieces of art. The first one is the Corpus clock. It's a clock made by John Taylor. It's on display at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. You might be able to see a picture of it up on screen now. And as you can see there, the dominating visual feature of the clock is this grim-looking metal sculpture of an insect similar to a locust. Taylor calls this beast the chronophage, literally the time eater. And as the seconds pass by, the chronophage moves its mouth, appearing to eat up the seconds as they pass by. The hour is told on his clock by the sound of a chain clanking into a small wooden coffin hidden in the back of the clock. And Taylor, he says, he's deliberately designed it to be terrifying. And this is what he says. Basically, I view time as not on your side. He'll eat up every minute of your life. And as soon as one has gone, he's salivating for the next. A very vivid portrayal of our inability to control time. A very powerful portrayal of the incessant march of time that will continue to roll on beyond our control. The other piece of art is actually a song written by Bob Dylan, The Times They Are A-Changin'. If you know the song, you'll know that the song is something of a challenge to people, to senators, to parents, that the times they are a-changin'. He says, no matter what you do, a new road is here. A new time has come, and you better either get with the program or get out of the way, because whether you like it or not, the times, they are a-changin'. His message is, you have no control over the changing seasons, over the changing times. And I think that reality resonates with us always, but especially perhaps now during this particular season marked by the restrictions on our freedom, the restrictions on what we can do because of coronavirus. It's a reminder that we can observe these different times, we can observe these different seasons, but actually we have very little control over them. Maybe today you had a very busy day planned in your diary before the coronavirus outbreak. And perhaps your day actually looks very different now. Perhaps for some of us, we had for this day or this time planned in laughter and leisure time, perhaps a post-Easter break. But quite out of our control, perhaps this day is not filled with laughter, but actually with mourning, with grief, with weeping, as the coronavirus continues to wreak havoc in our lives and the lives of our nation and our world. And the question that the teacher is asking is, well, how on earth can we live in a world like that, where we can see the changing seasons and the changing times, but we have no control over it? We can't get any gain from it. And his answer that he comes to in today's reading, I think, is this. Spend our time in God's story. That's what I think we see here. Spend your time in God's story. Just a little recap. The book of Ecclesiastes, remember the teacher is on this journey, this quest for gain, for profit, for something tangible, something left over of life. And he's conducting this thought experiment where he's confining himself to under the sun, only what he can see, only what he can perceive. He's almost bracketing God out of the equation. And as we're seeing over and over again, is when he looks at life that way, he's finding that life is mere breath. Life is vapor. there is no gain. He opens his hand and there's nothing there. And the answer that he's beginning to find, and we saw a little bit of last week, is that he needs to open the box. He needs to look above the sun. He needs to include God in the equation. And that frees him to start to live life as gift, not for gain. The teacher, you see, is slowly learning to include God in the equation. And that is what we see here again today. So in answer to that question, well, what do people gain from their toil? Verse 10, he includes God in the equation. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. He sees we need to include God and God's story in our equation and how we make sense of our time, of our life. He shows that we can recognize the times, but we can't always understand how they fit together. I'm reminded here of the Bayeux tapestry. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a big 70-metre long, embroidery actually apparently, not rather than a tapestry, portraying the Norman conquest of England, the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where Harold gets a arrow in the eye. And the thing about the Bayeux tapestry is that you can only ever look at it a little bit of a section at a time. Because it's 70 metres long, you can never get far enough back from it to view the whole thing all at once. You can't see it from beginning to end all at the same time. You have to view it in sequential little parts. And the teacher's saying life is a bit like that. We know there is an overarching story. We know there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. God's put eternity into our hearts. But we can't get far enough back from life. We can't get a vantage point on life where we can see the beginning and the end. Only God can see the beginning and the end and everything in between and how it all fits together. All we can see is our current time, our current season. And the teacher seems to be saying that the way that we can make sense of our current time, our current season, is to recognize that is part of a much bigger story, God's story. And he says when we include God in the equation, recognize he knows the end from the beginning, he knows the overarching story, well then we're enabled to live life differently. And he gives us these two statements which he begins with, I know. He says when we include God in the equation, verse 12, he says, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. He says when we spend our time in God's story, then we can recognize each time, each season as a gift from God. Not as times that we can try and control or manipulate or orchestrate to squeeze gain out of it, but recognizing this as part of a bigger whole, of which we're not the main character of. And we can recognize it as a gift from God's hand, to be appreciated and even enjoyed. You know, as I became a parent, I recognize that each sort of different developmental stage of a child, in one sense, presents a new crisis, a new challenge. And the temptation was for me to sort of constantly think, well, how can I just get through this stage or manipulate this stage or use this stage to make the next one easier or to get through to the next one? Sometimes I find myself thinking, well, it'll be easier when they can talk. Oh, well, when I can have a kickabout with them, then things will be better. Oh, well, when they've left home, ... But of course, the problem with thinking that way, of constantly trying to use this season and this time to extract gain or to get onto the next one, is that I end up missing out and wasting enjoying the times that I have now. Times that I'll never get back again. And the teacher's saying, don't use times to try to seek gain. Rather, enjoy the current time, enjoy the current season, enjoy the current day as a gift from God and use it to do good. Now, I don't deny that this current season, this current time is a hard one and comes with a lot of challenges. But when we see this season and this time as part of God's story, as part of a greater whole, then maybe we can accept this time, this season, this day as a gift from God and use it, enjoy it even, and do good within it. The teacher also gives a second I know statement. Verse 14, he says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. He recognizes that God is the only one who has that perfect grasp and control of time. And therefore God is the one to truly fear. Now when the Old Testament speaks about fear, it doesn't necessarily mean being afraid of God. I think more it's speaking about that trusting awe, that reverence for God, that complete and utter reliance upon God. It's recognizing when we spend our time in God's story and recognizing he's the one who knows the end from the beginning and everything that goes in between, and he's the one that controls it, well then actually he's the one to fear and to trust more than we fear the various things that are worrying us at the moment. Just imagine if we feared God as the controller of time more than we feared the things that are worries in our life. One person once said, worriers spend a lot of time shoveling smoke. Worriers spend a lot of time shoveling smoke. If life is mere breath, if it's fleeting, if it's hard to grasp, well, what do we gain by spending so much of our time trying to shovel these times and seasons in life to squeeze gain out of it? We can't. We end up just shoveling smoke. We end up just trying to herd the wind. But imagine if we lived our lives fearing God rather than fearing everything else, rather than trying to manipulate the times and seasons, rather than trying to shovel our worries about as though we could control them. Now, I know that there are a lot of things to worry about at the moment. I know that there are a lot of things that concern us at the moment. The teacher himself looks around and he still sees things to be worried about and concerned about. Verse 16, he looks around and he sees injustice and sees this is a problem. Verse 18 to 21, he looks and he sees death and the reality of death, and he says that's concerning. And we see perhaps some of those things now as well. But I think he's saying if we spend our time in God's story, then actually we can fear God more than we can fear those other things that are presenting challenges to our life. We can entrust ourselves to a God who does have control and can see the end from the beginning and who can control the times and the seasons. We can receive each day as a gift and do good in it. And we can fear God more than we can fear those things that are worrying us. Why? Well, finally, because the teacher says that if God's the one in charge, if it's really his story, then we know how the story ends. Verse 17. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. God's told us the end of the story. In fact, we can see even further than the teacher could see in the Old Testament. The Apostle Paul, when he spoke to the Athenians, made the same point. He says, look, if you want to understand your life, you need to fit it into God's story. And he proceeded to tell them the story of God that they needed to fit their lives into. And he told them how the story ends. In Acts 17, verse 31, he said, God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. On Sunday we celebrated Easter Sunday. We celebrated the resurrection of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. And Paul reminds us here that by raising Jesus from the dead, God has shown us how the story ends. He has shown us that there will be a day when Christ will return and when all who trust in him will be raised back to resurrection life. Death will be defeated. And there will be a day when Christ judges all and puts right all those things that are wrong. He will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Sickness and death and injustice will be no more. And when we recognize that that is God's story, and that that is how the story ends, even as we spend our time now in a very difficult time, in a very difficult season, that perhaps we can't see how it fits into that larger story. Well, if we spend our time in God's story, knowing how it ends, well then perhaps we can trust him, fear him in the messy middle of it. And we can even receive this day, this time, this season as a gift from him and do good. That's where the teacher ends, chapter 3 in verse 22, with finding satisfaction and enjoyment in God's gift of today, spending this time in God's story. Well, I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and your reflections on some of this as we meet over Zoom at 8:30. In the meantime, perhaps check out some of the songs that have been suggested below. But until then, I'll see you soon.